to celebrate North Carolina Beer Month of April, we've invited Bobby Bush back to educate us about some North Carolina beer and styles. He brought Randall Eichard with him, both from Hops and Grapes, and we're going to let them teach us some more beer science.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be back, Aaron. Appreciate the invitation. There's only one thing better than talking about beer, and that's drinking beer. Randall and I are going to help with the North Carolina beer celebration in April by talking about some of the North Carolina breweries and tasting the beers that we brought with us. So if you'll stick with us, maybe you'll learn a little bit. It's North Carolina, there are over 300 breweries, and we don't have 300 hours to do them all, so we'll do the best we can. We're going to highlight 6 breweries today. One thing, a reference source that I use quite often, although it's a little outdated, is this American Breweries 2. There is an American Breweries 1. This covers breweries up to 1995. So there, I think someone's working on a 3rd edition that'll bring us probably up into the 2000s, 2010 time frame. But by state, it lists every brewery that they knew, and even ones that were in blueprint form but never really opened. It'll have it on here. It shows what year they opened, if they were sold or changed names when that happened. The oldest operating brewery in North Carolina, obviously is post-Prohibition, is Weeping Radish Bavarian Restaurant and Brewery. The original one, which I visited years ago, was in Manteo. I don't believe it's operational as a brewery anymore. In fact, I think it's just a restaurant. But the brewery was relocated up to Currituck County probably 10 years ago. Uli Benowitz and his daughter, Uli's older than me, but so he's probably not doing much anymore except drinking. But they run a pretty neat kind of a tourist farm and butcher shop, and they make beer there. They have the Worst and the other beer sausages. It's a great place to visit. The next oldest is long out of business, but I remember it well, was in Charlotte back to 1988, Dilworth Brewing Company. It lasted a few years, and they had an argument with their neighbors, Kentucky Fried Chicken. They were using their parking lot. I think they eventually lost their lease. Weeping Radish in the 88 time frame. There were several other Weeping Radishes that opened kind of franchise in Durham. And then there was one in 88 called Weeping Radish Durham. Then it kind of transfigured into Old Heidelberg and on. 1989, the Greenshield Brewing Company in Raleigh was a very great place. Gary and Martha Greenshields were good friends of mine. He was a former Anheuser-Busch employee, if I'm not mistaken. There was Greensboro. The first was 1990 with a brewery called Loggerhead that didn't last but about 8 years. And then in the middle of that time frame was Gate City in Greensboro. It didn't last very long at all. But from Gate City sprung a brewery that we know now as Red Oak. It was originally called Spring Garden, that opened on Guilford College Road in 1991 in Greensboro. It's now moved to Witzel. If you're driving west towards Durham and Raleigh and Chapel Hill, you drive past that big brewery on I-85. Then in the western part of the state, the oldest dates back to 1993, Smoky Mountain Brewery in Waynesville. It didn't last long at all, and that brings us up to the current and second oldest brewery in the nation in North Carolina is Highland Brewing, and we're actually going to be tasting one of their beers in a minute. So as I said, we're going to kind of go through some interesting beers, different styles, talk to you a little bit about the brewery and a little bit about the styles, and I'm going to turn it over to Randall, and he's going to talk about a brewery up in Burke County.
All right, first we have Catawba Brewing. A little information about Catawba Brewing. They were founded in 1989 in Burke County, originally known as Catawba Valley Brewing Company.
Glen Alpine at that time was a dry part of Burke County, so they could brew there, but they couldn't sell their goods. They couldn't have a tap room. Quite honestly, the building they were in really didn't lend itself. It was the basement of an antique shop. They later, a few years later, relocated to downtown Morganton, right off of Green Street, and have done very well there. The owners are the Pyatt family. The head brewer is named Scott Pyatt, and his brother was Billy Pyatt, and Billy's wife Jetta were partners with Scott in the venture. And as I said, they've grown exponentially. They have a small brewery in Asheville now, and a tasting room at a different part of Asheville over near Biltmore Village. They have a Charlotte brewery, a 10-barrel system to go along with their 30-barrel system in Morganton. That has been very popular in the Charlotte area. They bought a large brewery, the oldest in the state of South Carolina, back in 2018, called Palmetto Brewing Company. That Palmetto is still operating as Palmetto Brewing Company. Still, they have their own brands, but all of their canned beer is now being brewed in Morganton and packaged and sent down to probably straight to the distributors in South Carolina for distribution, and some, I'm sure, to Palmetto Brewing Company. Let's see. After purchasing Palmetto Brewing Company, I thought they would stop for a while, but they just very recently announced that they had purchased actually a brew pub, a brewery with a restaurant and a bar, of course, near Wilmington, the beach area, called Skytown Brewing Company. So they're continuing to grow, continuing to expand their operation. And Randall's going to tell us about their formerly known as a cream ale, now.
All right, we have Farmer's Head's, originally called Farmer's Head's Cream Ale, now known as Farmer's Head's Golden Ale. It's based on a German lager, very light, refreshing, more akin to, like we call it, like an introduction to craft beer. Think of it as like a craft version of something like a Budweiser, per se, but a lot more flavor.
A lot more integrity too.
And and more true to the style as well.
Exactly. It's very lager-like, but it uses an ale yeast. It gets that characteristic from actually being lagered in tanks for an extended period, probably of several months in this case. But this is a great, easy drinking beer. It's a good lawnmower beer. If you go out and get hot and sweaty in your yard, this will help quench your throat, pour it over your head if you're that hot. 6% alcohol, and it's got a little sweetness from the cornmeal, corn malt that's used with the malted barley, flaked corn. Excuse me. I asked this question one time when they changed their name. We think that they don't call it a cream ale anymore, even though technically that's the style it's in, because a lot of their customers, many of whom were new to craft beer, thought it had cream in it.
We should also mention that misconception also comes from now you have a lot of beers that are brewed with lactose, so that can also be a little bit misleading.
Now, I'm lactose intolerant. No, I'm not, but it does not have cream in it. But it's now called a golden ale, so I guess you have to worry about gold. All right. We'll move on to my turn. Highland Brewing Company, as I said, is the second oldest operating brewery. You want to get that next beer out. Second oldest operating brewery in North Carolina. It's in Asheville. It was founded there in 1994, actually December of 1994, by a man named Oscar Wong, who had some silent partners. He's always been the only known owner. He and his head brewer, John McDermott, who had brewed, I believe, at Dilworth Brewing Company that I mentioned earlier from my American Brewers book, and a young apprentice named John Lytle. Well, Mr. McDermott was a very creative person. He didn't stay probably more than 2 or 3 years before he went off on a new venture. He started making handmade furniture, probably for friends and families and by contract. Just a very, very talented guy. I hate he didn't stay in the brewing business, but it probably wasn't enough for him, quite honestly. But the original Highland Brewing was in the basement of a bar called Brawley's, right on Biltmore Avenue, and it was just chopped up into little rooms. I remember walking in there in probably early 1995, and I was greeted by Oscar. He didn't know who I was, and I certainly didn't realize he was the owner, but he was very friendly and took me through the catacombs of the brewing operation they had there. And quite honestly, it was pretty amazing that they were able to get the beer out of, as much beer out of that little hole in the wall, or hole in the basement as it was. But they've grown exceedingly well. They got out of the basement and moved to a really large facility just outside of Asheville, kind of south, I guess to be the southeast part of Charlotte. They have a huge bar tap room. They have a rooftop garden that can hold 300 people. They have a solar panel display that's amazing. Go to their website sometime. Oscar has more or less retired from brewing. That was actually his retirement. He took his retirement money and opened a brewery. And his daughter Leah, I'm going to guess, to be nice, Leah, if you're watching this, she's probably in her mid-40s. But anyway, she's doing a great job. They're bringing on the new brands. They're keeping an old brewing company. Quite honestly, they're keeping it current with the beers they make, the bands they have on the roof and in their tap room. It's pretty amazing. The Highland Gaelic is probably, or was probably, their flagship beer. It's the only beer they make, even though their name was Highland. It's the only beer that they make that's really even close to a Scottish ale. They now call it a red ale. What does it say on the bottle?
Amber.
Does it say an amber or red?
Our flagship, exceptionally balanced, malty sweetness, delightfully hopped.
Yeah, I saw it on one website listed as a red ale. As you can see, it is a little red in color. It's let me taste it, but it's malty. There might be a little touch of hoppiness, a little stringency towards the end of the flavor profile. There is Cascade and Willamette hops in this 5.8%, so it's pretty light.
Some toffee notes there.
Surprised me, it's even lighter in alcohol than the Golden Ale from Catawba. Do what?
It's also a little bit of toffee note as well.
Toffee from the malted barley.
Bobby was saying, I think their location that they occupy right now, I believe, was a film studio. Isn't that correct?
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. It's a huge. They've got room to grow. Randall and I went up one when they were releasing their Christmas beer, Cold Mountain. We went up early one morning. We got there way too early. And remember, we were waiting in the parking lot, and Oscar saw us and took us on a private grand tour of the whole place. I think we were the only ones in the building, just about.
It was a Sunday.
And that's probably been, what, 4 or 5 years ago?
Something like that, yes, sir.
And the facility is really nice. They're struggling, as many breweries are, with the COVID situation. They actually shut their tap room down for a while, but now they've opened, or they're getting ready to open back up. And if you haven't been there when you're in Asheville, it's worth the visit. Even if you're not crazy about their Highland Ale, they've got a bunch of other great beers that you can try too. This one has a lot of history. That's why we brought this to the table today.